The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel, where Manhattan's elite gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. Designer gowns rustled against polished surfaces, while the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation filled the air. This wasn't just any charity event, it was the social calendar's crown jewel, where appearances mattered more than authenticity, and where one's worth was measured by the designer label on their dress and the zeros in their bank account. Among the glittering crowd stood Evangeline Rothschild, a woman whose very presence commanded attention. Her midnight groove Valentino gown hugged her statuesque frame perfectly, while diamonds worth more than most people's annual salaries adorned her neck and wrists. At 42, she had perfected the art of looking down on others, both literally and figuratively. Her sharp green eyes surveyed the room with the calculated precision of someone who had spent decades navigating high society's treacherous waters. But tonight something felt different. Tonight there was an electricity in the air that even Evangeline couldn't quite place, a sense that the carefully constructed world she knew so well was about to shift in ways she never could have imagined. Evangeline's life had been a masterclass in inherited privilege. Born into the Rothschild dynasty, she had never known want, never experienced the sting of rejection based on her appearance, and certainly never had to worry about the condition of her shoes. Her penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, her walk-in closet rivaled most boutiques, and her social calendar was perpetually booked with events that mattered to people who mattered. She moved through the gala with practiced ease, air-kissing acquaintances, and making small talk about vacation homes in the Hamptons and upcoming trips to Paris. Her husband, Richard, a successful investment banker, worked the room with equal skill, their partnership more business arrangement than romantic union. They were the perfect power couple, beautiful, wealthy, and utterly convinced of their own importance. "Evangeline, darling," called out Vivian Ashworth, another socialite whose primary occupation seemed to be spending her deceased husband's fortune. "You look absolutely divine. Is that the new Valentino?" "Of course," Evangeline replied with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I had it flown in from Milan just yesterday. Sometimes you simply can't trust the local boutiques to have the latest pieces." As they chatted about trivial matters, the weather, the decor, the quality of the champagne, Evangeline's attention was drawn to the staff moving efficiently through the crowd. Servers in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres, while others ensured that no champagne glass remained empty for more than a moment. It was then that she noticed her, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, with warm brown skin and kind eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her years. She wore the standard black uniform of the hotel's housekeeping staff, but there was something about her posture, her grace, that set her apart from the others. The woman, whose name tag read Celestine, was carefully polishing the brass fixtures near the entrance, her movements precise and thorough. But it wasn't her work ethic that caught Evangeline's attention. It was her shoes. They were worn, those shoes. Not just used, but truly worn. The kind of worn that spoke of long hours on hard floors, of a person who couldn't afford to replace them when they should have been retired months ago. The black leather was cracked along the sides, the heels worn down unevenly, and there was a small tear near the left toe that had been carefully mended with black thread. To most people, they were simply shoes. To Evangeline, they were evidence of everything she believed separated her world from the world of those people. The servers, the cleaners, the invisible army of workers who made her comfortable life possible. Celestine worked with quiet dignity, her movements economical and purposeful. She had learned long ago that invisibility was often the best protection in environments like this. The less attention she drew to herself, the smoother her shift would go. She had bills to pay, responsibilities that weighed heavily on her young shoulders, and pride that ran deeper than the ocean. Her worn shoes were a necessity, not a choice. Every dollar she earned went toward more pressing needs. Rent for the tiny studio apartment she shared with her younger brother, textbooks for the night classes she attended when she wasn't working, and the medications her grandmother needed but couldn't afford. New shoes were a luxury she couldn't justify, no matter how much her feet ached by the end of each shift. But Celestine carried herself with a quiet strength that no amount of money could buy. She had learned that dignity wasn't about what you wore, but about how you wore it. And tonight, despite her exhaustion and her worn shoes, she wore her dignity like armor. The collision was inevitable in a room full of people more concerned with being seen than with watching where they were going. Evangeline, gesturing dramatically while telling a story about her recent shopping trip to Dubai, stepped backward, just as Celestine was passing with a tray of used glasses. The impact sent the tray flying, crystal glasses crashing to the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent ballroom. Champagne splashed across Evangeline's designer gown, leaving dark stains on the midnight blue fabric. "You clumsy fool," Evangeline's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Look what you've done. This dress costs more than you make in a year." Celestine immediately dropped to her knees, frantically trying to collect the broken glass while murmuring apologies. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'm so sorry. Please let me, don't touch me." Evangeline recoiled as if Celestine's proximity might somehow contaminate her further. "And look at those shoes. How can they even let you work here looking like that? Those pathetic, worn-out things are probably held together with tape and prayers." The crowd had formed a circle around them now, some faces showing embarrassment at the scene, others displaying the kind of morbid fascination that comes from watching someone else's humiliation. Phones appeared, ready to capture the moment for social media consumption. Evangeline's voice grew louder, more venomous. "This is exactly what's wrong with the service industry these days. No standards, no pride. Just look at yourself. Those shoes are an embarrassment. How can you even show your face in public wearing something so pathetic?" Each word was a dagger, carefully aimed to inflict maximum damage. Celestine's hands trembled as she continued to pick up the broken glass, a small cut on her finger beginning to bleed. But she didn't cry. She wouldn't give Evangeline that satisfaction. "I said I was sorry," Celestine whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Evangeline laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "The only accident here is that they hired someone who clearly doesn't belong in a place like this. Maybe if you spent less money on, well, whatever it is people like you spend money on, and more on proper work shoes, incidents like this wouldn't happen. It'd be really helpful if we had some good ideas. I mean, if you'd had some feedback." Evangeline laughed, a sound like glass. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Evangeline had identified the one thing that Celestine was most self-conscious about and used it as a weapon, not caring about the damage she was inflicting on another human being's dignity. But something remarkable happened in that moment of supreme humiliation. Celestine slowly stood up, the broken glass carefully collected in her hands, and looked directly into Evangeline's eyes. There was no anger there, no hatred, just a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just her own pain, but pity for the woman who had caused it. "You're right," Celestine said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "My shoes are worn. They've carried me through many long days and difficult nights. They've walked me to 3 jobs, through college classes, and to the bedside of people I love. They may not be beautiful, but they've never failed me." She paused, her gaze never wavering from Evangeline's face. "I hope someday you find something in your life that serves you as faithfully as these shoes have served me." With that, she turned and walked away, her worn shoes carrying her with more dignity than all of Evangeline's designer accessories combined. The crowd parted silently, many faces now showing shame at having witnessed such unnecessary cruelty. Hotel management quickly intervened, ushering Evangeline to a private room where her dress could be cleaned, while staff members efficiently cleared away the broken glass and restored order to the ballroom. But the damage had been done. Not to Evangeline's dress, which would eventually be cleaned or replaced, but to something far more precious and irreplaceable. As Evangeline sat in the private room, watching hotel staff attempt to salvage her gown, she found herself thinking about Celestine's words. The young woman's composure had been unsettling in ways that Evangeline couldn't quite articulate. She had expected tears, anger, perhaps even retaliation. Instead, she had received something far more disturbing. Compassion and wisdom that seemed to come from a place of deep understanding. The hotel manager, a nervous man named Peterson, kept apologizing profusely while his staff worked on the dress. "Mrs. Rothschild, I cannot express how sorry we are about this incident. The employee in question will be dealt with appropriately, I assure you." "What do you mean, dealt with?" Evangeline asked, surprising herself with the question. "Well, terminated, of course. We cannot have staff members who are so careless around our distinguished guests. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable." Something twisted in Evangeline's stomach. The thought of Celestine losing her job because of what had been, ultimately, an accident felt wrong in a way that she couldn't explain. "That won't be necessary," she heard herself saying. "It was an accident. These things happen." Peterson looked confused. "But Mrs. Rothschild, surely you want us to take action. Your dress alone can be replaced," Evangeline finished, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Don't fire her." The next morning, Evangeline woke in her silk-sheeted bed with a strange unease settling in her stomach. The events of the previous evening played on repeat in her mind, but not in the way she expected. Instead of feeling vindicated or righteous, she felt hollow. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant Miranda. "Don't forget about tonight's event at the Metropolitan Museum. The car will pick you up at 7 p.m. Also, there's been some interesting buzz about tonight's honored guest. Apparently, it's quite a surprise." The Metropolitan Museum event. Evangeline had been looking forward to it for weeks. The museum was hosting a special evening honoring young philanthropists and social entrepreneurs. The kind of event that attracted both old money and new, where networking opportunities abounded, and being seen was just as important as the cause being celebrated. But as she sipped her morning coffee and scrolled through her social media feeds, Evangeline noticed something troubling. Several posts from the previous evening's gala had gone viral, but not in the way she might have hoped. Videos of her confrontation with Celestine were being shared with captions like, "When privilege meets humanity," and "This is what's wrong with society." The comments were brutal. People were calling her out by name, sharing their own stories of workplace humiliation, and expressing outrage at her behavior. Her carefully cultivated image was cracking, and she could feel the foundations of her social standing beginning to shift. "Richard," she called to her husband, who was reading the Financial Times over his own coffee. "Have you seen these posts about last night?" He looked up, his expression grim. "I've had 3 calls from the foundation board this morning. They're concerned about the optics." For the first time in her adult life, Evangeline felt the cold touch of real consequences. Her actions had been witnessed, recorded, and judged by a court far more diverse and far less forgiving than her usual social circle. As the day progressed, Evangeline found herself obsessing over the evening's event. Who was this mysterious honored guest? Why was there such secrecy surrounding their identity? And why did she have the strangest feeling that her worlds were about to collide, in ways she couldn't predict? She made calls to her contacts at the museum, trying to gather information, but was met with polite deflection. "It's going to be a wonderful surprise," they assured her, "someone truly deserving of recognition." By late afternoon, her curiosity had transformed into something approaching anxiety. She had always prided herself on being in the know, on having access to information before anyone else. This mystery was eating at her in ways she couldn't fully understand. Her stylist arrived at 5 p.m. to help her prepare for the evening. As she stood in front of her full-length mirror, being fitted into a stunning emerald green gown, Evangeline caught sight of her own reflection and paused. When had those lines appeared around her eyes? When had her expression become so hard? "Mrs. Rothschild," her stylist inquired, "is everything all right?" "Fine," Evangeline replied automatically, but she wasn't fine. Something was shifting inside her, some long-dormant part of her conscience that had been awakened by the events of the previous evening. The Metropolitan Museum had been transformed into a wonderland of soft lighting and elegant displays. Unlike the previous evening's ostentatious gala, this event had a more intimate, sophisticated atmosphere. The guest list was smaller but no less prestigious, filled with people who had earned their place through achievement rather than inheritance. Evangeline arrived fashionably late, as was her custom, but found herself strangely nervous as she entered the main hall. The evening was already in progress, with guests mingling around displays showcasing the work of various young philanthropists and social entrepreneurs. She moved through the crowd with less confidence than usual, still feeling the weight of the morning's social media backlash. Several people who would normally have rushed to greet her seemed to avoid eye contact, and she could feel whispers following in her wake. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum director's voice rang out over the sound system, "if you could please take your seats, we're ready to begin this evening's program." The crowd moved toward the elegantly appointed dining area, where round tables had been set with the museum's finest china and crystal. Evangeline found her assigned seat at a table near the front, a good sign that her social standing hadn't been completely destroyed by the previous evening's incident. As she settled into her chair, she noticed the head table at the front of the room. It was set for the evening's honored guest and the museum's board members, with a single empty chair that would soon be occupied by the mysterious recipient of the evening's recognition. "Tonight," the director continued, "we honor someone who embodies the very best of what it means to give back to society. Our honored guest has overcome tremendous personal challenges to not only achieve academic excellence, but to create programs that have touched the lives of thousands of underprivileged children." Evangeline felt a strange flutter in her stomach. Something about this felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. She has worked multiple jobs to put herself through college, graduating summa cum laude from Columbia University with a degree in social work. She has created after-school programs in underserved communities, established scholarship funds for first-generation college students, and has been accepted to Harvard Law School, where she plans to focus on advocacy for workers' rights. The flutter in Evangeline's stomach became a full-blown churning. No, it couldn't be. Despite facing discrimination and hardship, she has never allowed circumstances to diminish her compassion or her commitment to helping others. She has shown us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact we have on the lives of others. Evangeline's hands began to tremble. She looked around the room, suddenly desperate to leave, but found herself trapped by the crowd and the ongoing presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this year's recipient of the Young Philanthropist Award, Miss Celestine Washington." The world seemed to slow to a crawl as Celestine walked into the dining room, but this wasn't the tired, uniformed woman from the previous evening. This was Celestine transformed, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that complemented her natural beauty, her hair styled in a way that framed her face perfectly, and, yes, wearing a pair of beautiful new shoes that caught the light as she moved. But it was her bearing that truly took Evangeline's breath away. Celestine moved with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, who had earned her place through merit and hard work rather than accident of birth. She was radiant, dignified, and utterly compelling. As Celestine took her place at the head table, her eyes swept the room, acknowledging the applause with gracious nods, and then, inevitably, her gaze found Evangeline's. For a moment time stood still. The two women looked at each other across the room, one who had everything handed to her, the other who had fought for every opportunity, one who had used her privilege as a weapon, the other who had transformed her struggles into strength. Celestine's expression showed no triumph, no vindication. Instead, there was something far more powerful: understanding, and perhaps even forgiveness. The museum director was speaking again, sharing details of Celestine's achievements, but Evangeline couldn't focus on the words. She was remembering the previous evening with new eyes, seeing not a clumsy maid who had ruined her dress, but a young woman working multiple jobs to support her family while pursuing her education and building programs to help others. Miss Washington will now share a few words about her work and her vision for the future. Celestine stood and moved to the podium with the same quiet grace she had shown even in her moment of humiliation. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily through the room. "Thank you for this incredible honor," she began. "I stand here tonight not as an individual, but as a representative of everyone who has been told they don't belong, everyone who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character, everyone who has been made to feel invisible." Evangeline felt each word like a physical blow. "I want to share a story with you about dignity," Celestine continued. "Yesterday evening I was working at a charity gala, one of 3 jobs I worked to support my family and pay for school. I was wearing my work uniform and my old shoes, the only pair I owned. In a moment of accident, I spilled some glasses, and a woman used that moment to humiliate me publicly, to mock my appearance and question my worth based on the condition of my shoes." The room had gone completely silent. Several people were looking uncomfortable, and Evangeline felt as though she might be sick. "But I want to thank that woman," Celestine said, her voice growing stronger, "because she reminded me why this work matters. She reminded me that there are still people in this world who believe that a person's value can be measured by their possessions, by their appearance, by their circumstances. And she reminded me that I have work to do." Celestine's speech continued, but she shifted away from the previous evening's incident to focus on her programs, her vision for the future, and her commitment to creating a more equitable society. She spoke about the children she worked with, the families she had helped, and the systemic changes she hoped to implement through her legal career. But Evangeline heard none of it. She was trapped in her own thoughts, replaying the previous evening over and over, seeing it now from Celestine's perspective: the humiliation, the cruelty, the complete disregard for another human being's dignity. It all came flooding back with sickening clarity. When Celestine finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood, moved by her words and her story, but Evangeline remained seated, paralyzed by the weight of her own actions. As the formal program concluded and people began to mingle again, Evangeline found herself frozen in place. She watched as people approached Celestine, congratulating her, sharing their own stories, connecting with her in ways that Evangeline had never experienced, despite decades of social events. "Evangeline?" Richard's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right? You look pale." She couldn't answer. How could she explain that she had just discovered that the woman she had humiliated the night before was not only accomplished and educated, but was being honored for her contributions to society? How could she admit that she had been so wrong, so cruel, so utterly blind to the truth? As the evening wound down, Evangeline knew she had to do something. She couldn't leave without acknowledging what had happened, without trying to make amends for her inexcusable behavior. But how do you apologize for something so fundamentally wrong? How do you ask forgiveness from someone you've tried to destroy? She waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching the head table. Celestine was speaking with the museum director and several board members. But when she saw Evangelina approaching, she politely excused herself. "Mrs. Rothschild," Celestine said quietly, her voice neutral but not unkind. Evangeline began, then stopped. All her social training, all her practiced charm, all her carefully constructed words seemed inadequate for this moment. "I don't know how to begin." "The beginning is usually a good place," Celestine replied with the hint of a smile. "I was wrong," Evangeline said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was so completely, utterly wrong. I had no right to speak to you the way I did, to judge you, to humiliate you. I was cruel and thoughtless and—" She paused, struggling to find words that could possibly encompass the magnitude of her remorse. "You were hurt," Celestine said gently. "Your dress was ruined, you were embarrassed, and you lashed out. I understand that." "No," Evangeline said firmly, "that's not an excuse." There is no excuse for what I did. I saw your shoes and I made assumptions about who you were, about your worth, about your place in the world. I was everything that's wrong with people like me." Celestine studied her for a long moment. "People like you? People who have never had to worry about anything real. People who judge others based on appearances. People who use their privilege as a weapon instead of a tool to help others." They talked for another hour, long after the museum had emptied of other guests. Celestine shared her story, how she had been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident, how she had worked since she was 14 to help support her younger brother, how she had fought for every opportunity and every achievement. Evangeline listened with growing amazement and shame. Here was a woman who had faced challenges that Evangeline couldn't even imagine, who had turned hardship into purpose, who had used her struggles to develop empathy rather than bitterness. During their conversation, Celestine revealed details that made Evangeline's heart ache with regret. She spoke about the nights she had studied by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, about choosing between buying groceries and buying textbooks, about the professors who had believed in her potential when she couldn't afford to believe in herself. She described the moment she had received her acceptance letter to Harvard Law School, how she had cried in the bathroom of the hotel where she was working because she couldn't afford to let her supervisor see her emotional response during her shift. "Those shoes," Celestine said with a soft laugh. "They were actually a gift from my grandmother. She saved for months to buy them for me when I started working at the hotel. She said every working woman needed at least one pair of good shoes. They were good shoes once, but they've carried me through so many miles, so many dreams." Evangeline felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the depth of meaning those worn shoes had carried. They weren't just footwear. They were a symbol of love, sacrifice, and determination. They represented a grandmother's hopes for her granddaughter's future, a young woman's refusal to give up despite overwhelming odds, and the dignity that comes from honest work pursued with purpose. "I want to help," Evangeline said finally. "I want to support your programs, your education, whatever you need. I want to do something meaningful with my resources." Celestine smiled, the first genuine smile Evangeline had seen from her. "I appreciate that. But the most important thing you can do is remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to really see someone else's humanity. Remember that everyone has a story. Everyone has struggles. Everyone deserves dignity." "I will," Evangeline promised. "I will never forget." "And maybe," Celestine added with a gentle laugh, "next time you see someone with worn shoes, you'll remember that they might be carrying them toward something extraordinary." In the months that followed, Evangeline's life changed in ways she never could have anticipated. She became a major supporter of Celestine's programs, but more importantly, she began to examine her own behavior and attitudes. She started volunteering at homeless shelters, not for the social recognition but because she genuinely wanted to help. She learned the names of the people who worked in her building, who served her at restaurants, who made her life comfortable in countless invisible ways. She discovered that when you treat people with dignity and respect, they respond with warmth and kindness that no amount of money can buy. Her relationship with Richard evolved, too. They began having real conversations about purpose and meaning, about how they could use their privilege to make a positive impact. Their marriage, which had been more partnership than passion, began to develop deeper roots. But perhaps most importantly, Evangeline developed a friendship with Celestine that enriched both their lives. They met regularly for coffee, where Celestine would share stories from her law school classes and her work with underprivileged communities, while Evangeline learned to listen without judgment and to see the world through eyes other than her own. 1 year later, Evangeline stood at another podium, this time at a fundraising event for Celestine's Scholarship Foundation. She looked out at the crowd, a mix of society figures and community activists, wealthy donors and scholarship recipients, and felt a profound sense of purpose she had never experienced before. "A year ago," she began, "I learned a lesson that changed my life. I learned that you can never judge a person's worth by their appearance, their circumstances, or their possessions. I learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact we have on others. And I learned that sometimes the people we dismiss as invisible are actually the ones who can teach us the most about what it means to be human. She paused, finding Celestine's encouraging smile in the crowd. I learned all of this from a remarkable woman who showed me grace when I deserved judgment, who responded to cruelty with dignity, and who taught me that the most worn shoes can carry the most beautiful souls. The audience applauded, but Evangeline wasn't finished. Tonight I want to challenge each of you to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in everyone you meet, and to remember that every person has a story worth hearing. Because you never know when someone in worn shoes might be walking towards something extraordinary.